Hi, you guys are watching Gamefob.com. I'm Eric Bell, and we're here with Dr. Travis Langley, who has a book called The Psychology of Batman.
Batman and Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night.
Oh, that's awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Well, I use psychology to look at Batman and the stories and the enemies and his sidekicks and even his love life, and I use them to help teach a little psychology. It's been a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but if you're going to do a book on the psychology of a specific superhero, you have to start with Batman. He's the one who is a superhero because of his psychology. And Spider-Man and Superman, they're heroes because of their psychology, but they're super because they got rocketed to Earth or bitten by a Spider-Man, by a spider. Batman made himself a hero. He decided to build himself into this larger-than-life character. And so we've got the tragedy, the trauma, the fascinating rogues gallery, and the variety of what goes on with them, ranging from sane to progressively more insane. And even looking at your criteria, it's like, do they qualify as insane by real-world standards? I get to do panels on the psychology of heroes at conventions like this with people like Michael Uslan, the executive producer of all the movies. He wrote a foreword for my book.
Oh.
Denny O'Neil, the man who wrote the first comic books I ever read, does panels with me sometimes and wrote an introduction for the book. Adam West joined us the first time we had a panel.
Oh, that's awesome.
We had Michael, we had Adam West, the actor who played Batman when I was a little kid. If you don't know that, I'm not sure why you're watching me. Jerry Robinson, who created the Joker, he did a panel with us that first time too. And so I get to meet interesting people by bringing in my love of psychology and my love of some very nerdy things.
Oh, yes.
And I'll have some other things I want to talk about, but it had to start with Batman.
It's interesting that you brought up like Adam West, because Batman has gone through a ton of transitions in character. I mean, since his creation in the 40s.
Right.
And
1939.
1939. This is one of the oldest superheroes, well, crime fighters, ever written. So it's interesting that you've taken that character. Do you talk about the different transitions of character that Batman has gone through when he was dark and then he was campy and it was more kid-friendly or overly kid-friendly to like when Frank Miller took it?
Yeah, matter of fact, chapter 2 is titled Which Batman? So I can go a bit through the history and pull some psychology at the different points, talk about the old 1940s movie serials and racism that was in some of those is where I bring in psychology there. And I go into the Adam West series, and while, they were lighthearted. When I was a little kid, I didn't know it was a joke. I knew it was exciting to see Batman. Later on, I found out it was a joke. But they do have, some things. They have mind control in there. They're not in anything that resembles the real world. Actually, I analyzed King Tut, one of his enemies in the book, as a character analysis. Like, does he have multiple personality by real-world standards? And I go through the different films and the cartoon, the Batman the Animated Series, which the definitive depiction of Batman.
That is.
That is the absolute best depiction of Batman ever. And I go through all the movies, and at the end of the chapter I go to, it's like, which Batman? Bright Knight, Dark Knight, Adam West, Michael Keaton, Christian Bale. And ultimately the answer to which Batman is yes. There is a core character that runs throughout them. There is no the Batman when you really get down to it. There are these many versions, but there is an essence that goes through it. There is this man, Bruce Wayne, this millionaire, billionaire, depending on the era, who, because of a tragedy that he went through, decides, with a bit of smugness to himself, that he can and should do things that the police either can't or won't, and that it makes sense to him to go out dressed as a bat to scare and beat up the bad guys and to help keep anybody else from going through what he went through when he was a kid. It's like when you look at conflicting legends of Robin Hood, there are certain things that run through them. If he doesn't carry a bow and steal from the rich, he's not Robin Hood. If he's not Bruce Wayne, if he's not Bruce Wayne, it can't be Dick Grayson as Batman. Dick Grayson as Batman is Dick Grayson running around dressed as Batman. Not to put down the stories when he was Batman. I love those stories. But at heart, it's not quite Batman.
And I noticed that every time they've ever tried to put someone different in the cowl, it never lasts as long, because it has to be Bruce Wayne.
Yes.
Now, when having a book off the psychology of Batman immediately reminded me of The Seduction of Innocent by Frederick Wertham, which was a very negative viewing of comic books and superhero comics, feeling that Batman portrayed the homosexual fantasy with his relationship with Robin. Superman was giving kids a false sense of invincibility. Wonder Woman wasn't acting like the ideal woman. Very old-fashioned, but it had a very traumatic impact on the comic book. I was wondering, taking a because that also was a psychological intake on the characters. How do you feel about that take? And do you feel that what do you feel about that parts? What that did to comics, and what would you hope your book would do towards comic books?
Honestly, I mean, for this book from the early 1950s, it's part of why I'm doing what I am now. I was reading a book called Superman on the Couch by Danny Fingeroth, in which he commented about how little had been written by anybody in the mental health profession regarding comics in the then 50 years since Wortham's book. Rattled the whole industry. I got to thinking about that, and I was looking up, it's like, he's right. There's been so little that any of us have said on this. That also happened to be the first time I went to Comic-Con. Yeah. And I taught a psychology and literature course in which I had students do assignments analyzing characters, and to show them how to do the assignments, I analyzed Batman. And so it all came together for me that summer that it's like, I need to write about comics. I need to contribute to the field, and I need to write about Batman. Now, Wortham, a psychiatrist, as a psychologist, I always have to point out, he was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. But Dr. Frederick Wortham, from everything I read about the man, he was actually a pretty decent guy. He stood up for the underprivileged. He was involved in the Brown versus Board of Education hearings. Some of his testimony helped end desegregation in the United States. He did a lot of good things, but boy, his views on comic books, where he's reaching conclusions. He's saying, all these delinquent youth that I've talked to, every single one of them has read a comic book. Well, so have the kids you weren't talking to. Yeah. At that point, everybody had read a comic book. They'd all seen baseball games too. Was he going to go blaming baseball? At one point, one example he used in the book, he talked about these kids who gave this other kid comic books and candy to get him to go steal from a store. Well, why not blame the candy? Why did he blame the comic books? He had his views about how comic books were corrupting the youth of America, how they were responsible for so much juvenile delinquency. I mean, he made this comment in hearings before the Senate about, compared to the comic book industry, Hitler was a beginner. And he shook up the industry for conclusions that were very unscientific. He didn't have a control group of non-delinquent kids that he's comparing to these. So, and I do go through, there's a section where I go through, actually I have these sections called case files in the book. It was going to be featured foes, but it's case files. I go through looking at specific enemies, and I go through Bane and the Joker, and there is one case file on Dr. Frederick Wortham.
Of course. Of course. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you
for talking with us. Can you tell us your name and the book so everybody knows what to go and get?
Dr. Travis Langley. The book is Batman in Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night. It's just $10 on Amazon, and I must say, love Gamefob.
You guys are watching Gamefob.com. I'm Eric Bell. See you next time.
Take care.